On February 24th, 1933, gangsters gunned down Dennis Ziegler here in Chicago. Ziegler died in his son's arms. He leaves behind 11 children and his wife, Edna.
I'm Lissa Morgans, and you're listening to Call Edna. Previously on Call Edna. The first one is Frank Nitti. I'm going to call him the new head of the Capone syndicate. But it's important to note that this is a really interesting time in organized crime in Chicago in 1932. It becomes much more like a business board of directors. So you could say that Frank Nitti is the leader, but there's sort of a lot of leaders of different types of industries. And we see a couple of big figures emerge. Once again, we have Charles Fischetti. In 1932, he appears to be in charge of high-end gambling and nightclubs. And then we have labor racketeering, which is led by Humphreys after the death of Red Barker. And I think this makes sense for someone like Nitti, who was trying to consolidate his power at this time, because racketeering would have been the new frontier of how to make money as a gangster. William Maloney. And I also don't think he has any kids. His widow is mentioned in his obituary, but the obituary itself is a little sparse on personal information. In terms of when he got married, he was still listed as single in the 1940 census when he was about 60 years old. And then in the 1950 census, he's finally listed as married. So I'm thinking he gets married for the first time around 60 to 70 years old. Episode 10, The Bodyguard. Hello and welcome back to Call Edna. As an announcement up front, if you want to follow the pod on social media, search Call Edna and you will find us on Instagram, Facebook, Patreon, etc. And as always, if you have a tip, feel free to email me at callednapodcast@gmail.com. And as a content warning, this episode will discuss the intimate details of capital punishment and suicide. As we're continuing to go suspect by suspect, we've reached another really big name. We've gone from William Maloney to Marie Humphreys to another huge contender, Frank Nitti. And although he's come up on this podcast before, for how important he is, it's probably a little less than you would have expected. And that's because he is so high up in the Capone syndicate by the time Bruce is murdered that there's no way in my mind that he would be the person pulling the trigger. But his role is so pivotal that we need to discuss him and discuss who his closest associates are. As Al Capone is incarcerated at the time of Bruce's murder, this is the person who has filled his shoes. Starting with some personal background on Nitti, he was born in Italy, and his name originally is not Frank Nitti, but is Francesco Raphael Nitto. And at some point, his last name is actually misspelled by a newspaper, and that's when he becomes Frank Nitti. He comes to the United States on a steamship when he's about 5 years old, and he moves to New York. Originally, Nitti is in the Navy Street Boys gang as a teenager, and that's where he meets Al Capone. And he later joins another famous gang in New York at that time, the 5 Points Gang. And he moves to Chicago around 1919, 1920, and originally he's sort of working a little bit of lower level crime. He works as someone who's heisting jewelry with none other than Jake the Barber, who we heard a lot about in our last episode. And he also works with Johnny Torrio, who is one of the predecessors of Al Capone in the criminal syndicate that becomes Capone's outfit. And he also works as a barber, making about $40-ish a week, which was pretty good money at that time. And around 1923, 1924, he becomes a full outfit member associated with Capone and helps with the takeover of Cicero, which is the place where Capone centers his criminal enterprise. And also at this time in 1923, Al Capone's brother Frank, who he was very close with, dies. And some academics theorize that Frank Nitti almost became an emotional substitute for Al Capone's brother Frank. And he becomes Al Capone's bodyguard, or at least one of them, from 1924 to 1926. And by 1926, he's one of the most trusted bodyguards of Al Capone. And by 1929, he marries his first wife, Anna, and he's also credited with help planning the St. Valentine's Day massacre. In 1929, we're starting to see how close he is to Capone and his syndicate. So much so that when Capone is charged with tax evasion, so is Nitti. But he's lucky in that he's not sentenced to the same lengthy amount of time as Al Capone, but he only serves about 18 months, from January 1931 to March of 1932. And in 1932, when Nitti is released, he commands control over the outfit. Putting a pause in our timeline, I wanted to discuss his vibe and sort of how he accomplishes this in 1932. There are so many other gangsters in Chicago at this time, so it's really interesting how he accomplishes taking over for Capone. And how he does it is essentially by not filling Capone's shoes, but changing the organization. So he liked to think of himself more like a corporate CEO as opposed to a gang leader. He was not the over-the-top, magnanimous personality that Capone was. So in many ways, he wasn't replaceable. And Nitti was not glamour-seeking. He was all about getting the job done. So if you picture a conference room where a large board of executives is going to have a meeting, Nitti sits himself at the head of the table and then surrounds himself with other high-ups in charge of important jobs. And one of the biggest things he does for the syndicate in his tenure is move into the labor racketeering space. Because as we know, in March of 1933, prohibition is going to be repealed. So as the syndicate is moving into labor racketeering with Humphreys, Nitti is also there. So he's behind a lot of the same techniques that Humphreys stood for, like kidnapping and bombing and other steamroller pressure tactics to get unions to comply with the syndicate's wishes. There are a couple of estimates as to how successful Nitti and Humphreys are at this. I found one figure that said it's possible 2 out of every 3 unions were controlled by the outfit. And in another article, I found that the American Federation of Labor conceded that about 28% of its Chicago locals were dominated by the outfit. And in addition to being control of unions, it's also estimated that about 100 Chicago area businesses and trade associations were in Nitti's control. And Nitti will die in 1943, so he's in charge of the syndicate for about 10 or 11 years. And now that we have the basic overview of how he ran the organization, I want to get into the time period that involves Bruce, because what happened with Frank Nitti and the Chicago outfit from December of 1932 to March of 1933 changed Chicago history, and there's something I haven't mentioned yet in this investigation. Back in 1932, at the end of the year in December, there's an attempt on Frank Nitti's life, and he is shot 3 times. But he doesn't die. And who is responsible for the hit on him is fascinating, because it's been determined that it was likely the Chicago mayor, Anton Cermak, and 2 Chicago police detectives. According to the New York Times on December 19, 1932, quoting, Frank Nitti, known as the enforcer of Al Capone's decrees and his principal man of business while Capone was building a fortune from Chicago bootlegging, was shot and possibly fatally wounded this afternoon by Detective Harry Lang of Mayor Cermak's office. Lang was shot in the hand. The shooting occurred in an office in the LaSalle Wacker building, a skyscraper in the fringe of the Loop. Lang and 3 other detectives, entering to make arrests in conformity with Mayor Cermak's orders to break up all meetings of hoodlums, found Nitti in conference with 6 of his aides. End quote. Then, according to this account, Nitti, quote, attempts to eat a paper. Reading again from the article, quoting, all but Nitti obeyed the command to raise their hands. He thrust a paper, which he had been reading, into his mouth and tried to chew it up. Lang leaped at him, seized him by the throat, and strove to make him disgorge the paper. As they struggled, Lang was wounded in the left hand. Wrenching himself loose from Nitti, the detective fired 4 shots. 3 of them struck Nitti, one in the right side of his neck, the second in the right side of his chest, and the last in the back near the spinal column. Nitti was taken to the Bridewell Hospital. Lang was sent to John D. Murphy Hospital, where a police guard was established in the fear of reprisals against him by the underlings of the enforcer." End quote. Now, it's important that I mention that this is the account in real time, on December 19th, 1932, and it becomes very clear thereafter that this is not exactly what happened, and we'll find out within the next few weeks and months, and even reporting up to present time, that something more sinister was going on. Lang actually shot himself to fake an injury from Nitti, and they were not coming by to do a normal arrest or seizure. They were likely coming by on a hit to kill Frank Nitti. And the person who may have ordered that hit was Mayor Anton Cermak. And that's because Cermak, who had replaced Governor Bill Thompson, who was very much in the pocket of Al Capone in the outfit, was against organized crime and attempting to clean up Chicago. And he apparently was very afraid for his life and thinking there was a hit out against him. So, what likely happened is that he ordered for Nitti to be taken out, but Nitti survives the encounter and recovers from his 3 bullet wounds. And then we're left with a real mess. From the New York Times on December 22nd, 1932, 3 days later, quoting, "The threats the hoodlums and gangsters have made against the police who are doing their duty are nothing short of a declaration of war," Mayor Cermak said in a written statement issued prior to his departure from Miami, Florida. "If this is what they want, then a war it shall be, for the Chicago police can fight when called upon to do so." Quoting more from Cermak, "My orders are to stop the nefarious activities of organized crime, and the police intend to carry out those orders to the fullest extent. If necessary, every place of business where hoodlums and gangsters without visible means of support hang out will have its license revoked and the place will be closed." End quote. So essentially, Cermak has waged war against Nitti, or maybe Nitti started it and Cermak responds with escalation. However you want to view it, now he has a real problem because Nitti survives, and one of the officers who joined Detective Lang during the hit speaks out at court proceedings that ensue regarding this encounter. In a wild string of prosecutions, originally Nitti is charged with attempting to murder Lang, and then Lang is charged with assault with attempting to murder Nitti. And there's actually apparently one day in court where Nitti sits as the defendant for shooting Lang. That case then goes away, and later in the day he participates as the victim, where Lang is charged with assault. And this to me is one of the most interesting things, is that Lang is kicked off the Chicago police force, and then he's formally charged with assault of Frank Nitti. And the main prosecutor in his case is none other than Thomas Courtney. And this is something I just can't really picture. When I think of someone who is the head of a criminal syndicate, I typically think of someone who lives outside of the law, outside of the justice system, because that's how their business works. It works in the shadows and the corners of society. It doesn't work in the courtroom. In the courtroom is where we're supposed to have the scales of justice. So when someone like Nitti is shot, particularly by a government official, my first thought is that likely that government official is not going to be punished. And if they're going to be punished, maybe they're going to lose their job, but they're not going to be prosecuted. I mean, in the words of Cermak himself, he said there was a war going on between these factions. And gang members have killed a lot of people in Chicago, and nothing's happened to them. So I wouldn't expect there to be a prosecution for an attempted murder of someone like an Al Capone or Frank Nitti. But the Chicago we're dealing with does not center around the justice system or anything like that. It centers around people like Frank Nitti. So there is a formal prosecution by Thomas Courtney. I will say the charges eventually disappear. Lang does not serve any prison time, and I saw differing accounts. But from what I can gather, there was some testimony against him by another police officer that he shot Nitti. I know that testimony is in the grand jury setting. I think it's also in the trial setting, but there's no verdict retained against Lang or another one of the officers who was there that night, Miller, but rather they're both fired from the force and fined $100. And that's because something even more escalating happens. And also, according to the outfit by Gus Russo, Lang said, quote, "I will blow the lid off of Chicago politics and wreck the Democratic Party if I have to serve 1 day in jail," end quote. And the escalation that happens that puts this Nitti and Lang story on the back burner involves Mayor Cermak. Okay, now we're in January of 1933, and things are about to get very interesting because Nitti is not going to take a hit against him lying down. So the first thing that happens on January 7th is that Ted Newberry is found dead. And if that name sounds familiar to you, it's because we've heard this name before. If you think back to Murray Humphrey's FBI files, Newberry was murdered and Humphreys was questioned to be involved in his murder. And now we know why the outfit wanted Newberry dead. Newberry was associated with Bugs Moran, a rival gang to Al Capone, the same gang who they took out in the St. Valentine's Day massacre. And apparently, Newberry was in support of Mayor Anton Cermak's cleaning up of the city against the Capone syndicate. And it's possible that he had also put out a hit against Frank Nitti. Whether this hit is the same one or different than Mayor Cermak's, I'm not sure. I'm sure someone like Frank Nitti had a lot of hits out against him, but these ones were high profile. So Newberry is taken out by the outfit. And then on February 1st, Nitti begins a 75-day bombing campaign to reassert his power and authority throughout Chicago. Noting the date, February 1st, we're now getting close to the date in which Bruce was murdered, February 24th, 1933. And this is when things start to get really interesting. Because on February 15th, 1933, a week prior to Bruce's murder, Mayor Anton Cermak is mortally wounded in Miami, Florida. So we're a week prior to Bruce's murder. The mayor of Chicago is shot, and I wanted to pause and tell you a little bit more about him. Mayor Cermak is elected in Chicago in 1931, and he's elected as a reformer candidate on a reform platform against the corrupt Big Bill Thompson, who has been associated with corrupt politics and Al Capone for years. Cermak himself is an immigrant, and he is credited with being the father of Chicago's democratic machine. And he aligns himself with other reformers of the time, with one name that we all know, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he campaigns for Roosevelt intensely during the 1932 presidential election. So much so that there's a majority in Cook County of 330,000 votes in FDR's favor. They align on social reform that they believed was needed during the Great Depression, and they also aligned on ending prohibition. Although Cermak was there before Roosevelt, who took a longer time to endorse the end of prohibition, what was considered being a wet politician as opposed to a dry politician, because he was supported by many dry communities in his electorate. But when FDR accepts the nomination, he does so on a platform to also end prohibition. And while Cermak ran on a lot of promise of reform, he also was dealing with the reality of the Great Depression, the effect it had had on Chicago, and the current state of the government, which, as we know, was quite corrupt. And something I found particularly interesting about Cermak is that, kind of similar to FDR's fireside chats that he'll do later in his career, Cermak had weekly radio talks to the people of Chicago that were called, quote, intimate chats. And Cermak goes to Miami on February 7th, 1933, to meet up with President-elect FDR. And he ends up riding in a parade with Roosevelt at Belmont Park in Miami on February 15th, 1933. And this is where Cermak is shot by a man named Giuseppe Zangara. And there's a lot of different accounts here, but apparently after he fires the first shot, multiple members of the crowd that he's in hit his arm and try to get him to stop, but he's still able to fire 4 more shots. And the 5 bullets hit 5 different people. None of them actually hit Roosevelt, and Cermak doubles over. He does not immediately die. He's wounded, so he's taken to the hospital. The next day, February 16th, 1933, the Tribune reports that Cermak had more than a 50-50 chance at recovering, and that his condition was dangerous but not immediately critical. He's visited by Roosevelt in the hospital, and Cermak has a message for the public while he lays in the hospital, saying, quote, "Tell Chicago I'll pull through." As we know, Bruce is murdered on February 24th, 1933. So at this time, Mayor Cermak is lying in his hospital bed in Miami. He is not in control of Chicago. And on March 4th, Roosevelt takes office. 2 days later, Mayor Cermak dies on February 6, 1933. And I just wanted to pause here because this is extraordinary. If you're thinking about this time in American history and in Chicago history, I know this podcast is focused on Bruce's murder, but this period is so much larger than that because the mayor of Chicago is assassinated, and maybe some of you as listeners knew that, but my guess is that most of you didn't. And the fact that at the time when Bruce was murdered, the mayor himself was lying, fighting for his life in a hospital bed is not lost on me. It makes me think of this time period in February of 1933 when Bruce was murdered as a window of unrest and lawlessness. And that is also not our last death, because on March 20th, Zangara is executed for the murder of Mayor Cermak in Florida by the electric chair. Originally, he's sentenced to 80 years of hard labor, but he is resentenced to die after Cermak dies in the hospital. And the time from his trial to his execution is the quickest in 20th century American history. And there's a quote attributed to him, quoting, "I have always hated the rich and powerful. I do not hate Mr. Roosevelt personally. I hate all presidents, no matter from what country they come," end quote. And based on his statements and investigations at the time, the story was clear that he was attempting to assassinate Roosevelt, but instead hit Cermak. And on March 20th, 1933, he's strapped into the electric chair at 9:11. Electrocution starts at 9:15, and he's pronounced dead at 9:27. So although from the time his trial started to when he was executed, it's considered to be the quickest trial and execution in 20th century America, I can't help but think about how long those 12 minutes seem. And you may be thinking of the alternate theory of Cermak's death already. Was Zangara there for Roosevelt? Or was he there for Mayor Cermak, the man who had attempted to kill the head of Al Capone's outfit? Was it in fact Frank Nitti who ordered for Cermak's death and covered it up? Police investigators at the time said they did not find any connection between Zangara and the Chicago outfit, but I've read a lot of skeptical accounts of people thinking that things in Chicago involving violence are never a coincidence. And there were a lot of attendees at Cermak's funeral, about 30,000 in the procession itself, and then about 50,000 in total at the cemetery to lay him to rest. Because if you're thinking about the demographic makeup of Chicago at this time, it resembled people like Cermak, and this was a loss for the community. And we'll never know if Nitti had a role in this or not, but I think it's very important in considering the time period in which Bruce was murdered, what these big players were doing, and what their motivations were. And after Roosevelt takes office, prohibition is repealed on March 15th of 1933. Moving on with Nitti's timeline, as we know from our Murray Humphreys and Tui episode, he helped organize the fake kidnapping of Jake the Barber in July of 1933. And there's two people whose names have come up a few times who are listed as popular gunmen associated with Frank Nitti. And that's Charles Fischetti, a name that's come up a few times now, and Frank Diamond. Nitti will remain in power in the outfit until 1943. Because if you thought the last tragic death of this episode was Zangara's, you were mistaken. Because Frank Nitti will die by suicide in 1943. At this point in time, some of the outfit's criminal enterprise activity had started to catch up with them. This is the subject of a whole other podcast, but the outfit gets quite involved with Hollywood and movie making as another form of racketeering and extortion, and Nitti and other big names are indicted in New York for racketeering. But he decides he's not going to face the criminal justice process. And this is when three men who are members of a freight train crew see a man who appears drunk and is walking amongst the train tracks. And then they hear two gunshots. And at first they think that maybe the man is firing at them. And that's when they realize that the man has fired them at himself. They have no idea who he is, but one of the members of the crew remembers making eye contact with him before he fires the final fatal shot into his head. The first shot had missed Nitti's head and had gone through his fedora. The second shot went into his right jaw and out the top of his head, but didn't kill him. And then the third shot went in behind his ear and lodged into the top of his skull. The men from the train called into the police station to say that they had seen a man shoot himself. And the coroner's toxicology report came back that Nitti's blood alcohol content was 0.23. And stories immediately came out. The other individuals, high-ranking members of the outfit and elsewhere, had encouraged him to take out one of the men who was going to testify against them in New York. And that man did eventually testify against the others after Nitti's death. He then was given a new identity after testifying, started a new life in a new part of the United States under a new name. And in 1955, this witness died when a bomb went off in his pickup truck. Going back to Nitti, Frank Nitti was 57 years old when he died, the same age as Bruce, with 3 shots to his head, same as many of the accounts in Bruce's murder as well. This has been a heavy episode. And before we pick up with next week's, there are a couple of smaller loose ends that I wanted to talk about. One of them involving William Maloney. As I mentioned during the episode on Maloney the snake, I said that it was difficult to find census information in the 1920s and 30s for Maloney. I was sort of curious about what went on in his personal life at this time. And in the family papers, I found a news article indicating that he had been in a car crash with his wife, Gladys, a different wife than the one mentioned in his obituary. I'm not sure what happened to Gladys. They seem to both survive the car accident, but I want to mention that this article, although not dated, lists Maloney as 45 years old. So it was either 1925 or 1926. So there is still more to Maloney's personal life that we don't know from this time period. And there's even more to Bruce's personal life that I recently discovered, and I wanted to talk about it with my dad. What are you doing? I sent you a text a few weeks ago with a news article I found about Bruce from the day book. Did you read it?
From the day book?
Yeah.
Je ne sais pas.
That's okay. So, do you know...
I don't remember.
Do you know what the day book is?
No.
So, I didn't either. The day book was a newspaper in the 19-teens. Oh, you have a cat. Structured for the 95% of the population. So it's for the working class person. And Bruce was featured in it in 1915.
Okay, that's cool.
Yeah. This is it. So, the day book from February 10th, 1915. And look at this article.
Okay.
Oh, you want the seat? Oh, okay. Wonderful.
Member tells of hoisting engineers' troubles. The business connection between the Building Construction Employers Association and President James G. Hanahan of Local 69, Hoisting Engineers Local 69, are questioned in a letter to the daybook from Dennis B. Ziegler, former vice president of Local 69. Ziegler says it should be understood that the vote of Local 69 in favor of the, quote, model agreement, quote, and the, quote, peace movement, unquote, does not have the support of a majority of the members of that local who were in the organization last year, Ziegler writes. Ziegler says, last April, the charter of Local 69 was revoked for an alleged violation of the international Constitution. This violation, it was alleged, arose through Local 69 entering into an agreement with the Sewer Contractors Association by which the men were granted $1 an hour, 8 hours a day, and Saturday half-holiday the year around, with double time for work Saturday afternoons, Sunday, or holidays. The minimum rate as fixed was a straight increase of 25 cents per hour for the workmen. Ziegler continues, strange to say, Hanahan opposed this agreement, as did his ally, Matt Comerford, president of the International, and the balance of the gentlemen of the General Executive Board. So peeved were they at the men bettering wages and working conditions that they revoked the charter of the local. A new charter was later issued to Hanahan's and 31 of his henchmen. They are the only organization I have found of so far that has endorsed the employer's model agreement. Ziegler continues, to us who know Hanahan's record and the fact that he took action against us because of a contract which raised our wages from 75 cents to $1 an hour, it is clear why Hanahan has jammed through Local 69 a vote of endorsement for a so-called model agreement put out by the Building Contractors Association. Ziegler concludes, I want to say right here on behalf of former Local 69 to the Construction Employers Association that we are fearful certain of your officers are using your organization for personal aggrandizement, as James G. Hanahan did our organization until we got next. In closing, I wish to say that the membership of our local are determined to stand or fall as one together. Is that it?
Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it looks like it's, kind of 18 years prior to his murder by the mob. It looks like him complaining about the improper activity between some folks within the union and working to the disadvantage of the workers.
Did you know he was vice president of a union prior to...
No, I didn't realize he was vice president all the way back to 1915.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he went from vice president to secretary?
Different unions.
Oh, I see. Okay, because this is Local 69 as opposed to, I can't remember the number of his, was it 569?
Yeah.
The number of his, the union he was in at the time he was murdered?
Yeah.
Okay.
So Bruce's involvement with Local 569 was not the only time he had been involved in fighting for members of his union and against what he viewed as corrupt, unfair, and undemocratic processes. The fact that he had been fighting similar fights since 1915 was astounding. Given our perspective in 2026, at a time where I find it difficult for one to keep up their perseverance against things they view as undemocratic, it's incredible to imagine Bruce fighting for workers' rights, for at least 18 years or more. And although I said we're going suspect by suspect, I never thought Nitti was someone who would have pulled the trigger. But I do think it's incredibly important for us to consider the head of the Capone syndicate's mindset at this time, for the fact that he was on an aggressive campaign and maybe tying up some loose ends of people who had been bothering him, like Newberry or Cermak, for a while. And I have to wonder, is Bruce one of those people? And was it a particularly good time to take out Bruce when the news cycle potentially wouldn't care about it as much? With the mayor fighting for his life in Miami, FDR about to become president, and prohibition about to be repealed. You may have noticed that we started with the top people in the criminal syndicates we're considering, with Maloney, with Humphreys, with Nitti, and there's one more person we need to discuss before we get into potential hitmen, and that's Mike Carrazzo. So I'll see you next time in The Boss.